Great, thank you, Margaret, for leading us through the first part of our service. And as you know, we're working our way through Mark, just dipping in and picking out stories through the Gospel of Mark. And one of the beautiful things about the way Mark structures his Gospel is that he quite often tells stories inside of stories. When I was at Trinity, when I did my course there a couple of years ago, I learned that biblical scholars call this the Markan sandwich, where he starts one story and then he interrupts it with another story and then he goes back and finishes the first story. And the passage which Margaret gave me for this morning, it's in Mark 5, if you want to find it in your Bibles, and it's the story of Jesus healing the woman with bleeding condition, and it's one of these Markan sandwiches. It's the filling, if you like, inside a story of Jairus, the synagogue leader, who comes to Jesus to ask him to heal his daughter, who's dying, and Jesus agrees to do that, and he sets off, and the crowds go with him, and then Mark interrupts that story with this story that we've got for this morning. So let's read it. It's Mark 5, and beginning at verse 25 through to verse 34. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." And at first glance, this is another healing story, and it is. But when Jesus heals, it's rarely just about the physical. And so we need to slow down and look carefully at what's going on here. And we begin to realize that there's something deeper going on, that actually this is an unveiling of the heart of the Father and a demonstration of the truth of what Jesus has come to do for all of us. We meet in this story a woman. We don't know her name, but we know that she's been suffering from some kind of bleeding condition for 12 years. 12 years of sickness, 12 years of discomfort, 12 years of weakness probably. If you're constantly losing blood, you're going to be pretty weak. Life is physically difficult for her. 12 years is a long time to live with any kind of sickness, but this particular sickness had consequences far beyond the physical discomfort. And to understand that, we need to go back into the Old Testament law, to the Torah, and specifically into the purity laws that we find in Leviticus. In Leviticus 15, we're told that a woman with ongoing bleeding was considered to be ritually unclean. And that means she is unclean. It means anything she touches becomes unclean. It means anyone she touches becomes unclean. And anyone who touches her becomes unclean. So people avoided her. She lost human contact. We don't know, but it could well have meant that she wasn't married. It could well have meant that she didn't have children, which would have brought great dishonour to a woman in that time and place and culture. So socially, the effect of her illness was devastating to her. But it also meant that she was unable to participate in the community worship. She was not allowed to enter the synagogue because she was unclean. She was constantly told that she was not clean enough to enter the presence of God. She could not take her sacrifices to the temple. She wasn't allowed to do that, so she had no assurance of the forgiveness of sins because she couldn't partake in the prescribed sacrificial system. She was told that she was separated, therefore, from God because of her condition. At least that's the way she would have understood it and the way people around her would have seen it. So here was someone living on the edges of society. People avoided her. She was isolated, and she lived with the constant message that something about her made others unclean. She was not allowed to participate in the life of her community. But it gets even worse, because Mark goes on to tell us that she has spent all that she had on doctors who couldn't help her. She was not only sick, not only socially and religiously isolated, but she was also broke. She had exhausted every option, every treatment, every doctor, every hope. And instead of getting better, she grew worse. A completely hopeless situation for 12 years. But then one day, she hears about Jesus. And that phrase matters, particularly in Mark, because so often Mark emphasizes that hearing about Jesus precedes faith in Jesus. Somewhere in the stories that are circulating about the villages and the markets, she hears about this man from Nazareth. She hears about his compassion. She hears about the authority with which he speaks, and she hears about the way that sick are healed and the broken are restored. And as she hears these stories, something stirs within her. For the first time in ages, she has a sense of hope. And so she decides to go and see for herself. But she knows that she cannot get an audience with Jesus, because in order to get close to him, she would have to be out in public. She would have to push through the crowds. And remember, anyone she touched would become ceremonially unclean. There would be absolute mayhem if anyone recognized her in that crowd, perhaps even to the point where her life would have been in danger. So she can't go openly to see Jesus. So instead, she comes up with a plan to do it covertly, no doubt to pull her cloak over her head to avoid detection, and to work her way through the crowd and just to reach out and touch his garment from behind and then to disappear. That's her plan. And as she reaches out and touches his cloak, we're told the bleeding stopped and that she knew in her body that she'd been healed. Now, this isn't magic. Jesus isn't some kind of spiritual vending machine that's dispensing miracles to those lucky enough to touch his magic cloak. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that in Jesus, the life of God has entered into humanity. The eternal love of the Father, Son, and Spirit has stepped into our world and taken hold of humanity. So when this woman reaches out and touches Jesus, she's not just reaching out to a man, she's reaching out to the one in whom the life of God flows. And in that healing, in that contact, healing flows to her from the Father's heart in the power of the Spirit through Jesus. And she knows it, and her body knows it. Mark tells us that she knew immediately that she'd been healed of her bleeding. And her plan then was to disappear. But that doesn't happen, because Jesus stops walking and asks, "Who touched me?" He knows, of course, who it was, but he needs her to come forward because he's not done yet with his work in her. And the disciples are confused. You see all this crowd around you. You know, everyone's pressing in on you, Jesus. How can you say, "Who touched me?" Everyone's touching you. But he perseveres. And he keeps looking until she comes before him, and she tells him what she's done. I imagine she tells him the whole story, the whole 12 years. And then Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." This is the only time recorded in any of the Gospels where Jesus calls anyone daughter. For 12 years, she's been defined by her illness, defined by uncleanliness, by impurity, defined by exclusion. And Jesus gives her a new identity, daughter, a word of belonging, a word of family, a word of restoration, a word of inclusion. Jesus does not want just to heal her physically, he wants to heal her spiritually too. And when Jesus calls this woman daughter, he's revealing the truth about her identity. She belongs. She always did, and now that belonging is restored and announced publicly. Think about the tenderness of that moment. Jesus could have allowed her just to slip away anonymously, as was her plan. The miracle had already happened, the bleeding had stopped, but instead Jesus interrupts his mission to save Jairus' daughter and to spend time instead with this woman, because healing is not only about the body, it's about restoring the heart as well. He wants her to know that she is not an invisible recipient of an impersonal power. She is a beloved person who matters to God. And so he calls her forward so that she can hear the word daughter. And I don't think it's coincidence that in this Markan sandwich, in this story within the story, that the outer story is about a man called Jairus, who is the synagogue leader, the very institution that had excluded this woman. He's the important one, the religious leader, the one who's supposed to be close to God, and yet Jesus interrupts his story in order to restore the outcast, the unclean, the one who was not allowed into the synagogue. And I think there's a lesson there for us as well. We in the church do not have a monopoly on the grace of God. And sometimes he will interrupt our plans, our story, to bless those that we're failing to bless outside of the church. But Jesus said something else that really stood out to me as I read this through. He said, "Your faith has healed you." Last week, John told us about the faith of the friends that brought the paralyzed man to Jesus, and that Jesus noticed their faith and then healed the man. And this week, Jesus says it's the faith of this woman that has healed her. I must admit, my first thought was this wasn't faith, this was desperation. You know, she tried everything else, what has she got to lose? But then I realised this was actually potentially a very costly thing for her to do, both in terms of the physical effort that it took a sick woman to get to Jesus, but also the risk of her being discovered pushing through crowds in public. This was a very courageous thing for her to do. So then I started thinking about faith. You know, what is faith? It's one of those words we use a lot, isn't it? But I don't know if we necessarily really know what it means. Often I think we interchange it with belief. So I wanted to understand a bit more about faith, and I went and read Hebrews 11, which is probably the most famous passage about faith in the Bible. Well, actually, I didn't read it. I listened to it. And I listened to it actually at 1.5 times speed, because I was trying to get through it, which probably made it stand out even more to me, actually, because it is just story after story after story of people in the scriptures who were commended for their faith. And what I realized as I was listening to that is that all these people had believed something and then acted on their belief. They'd reached out and grasped hold of something. There were people who believed a promise that God had given them and then lived as if that was true. I think often we can think about faith simply as it meaning believing the right thing, don't we? But all these people in Hebrews 11, they believed and then they acted. Hebrews 11 starts off in verse 1 with a definition of the faith, which the NIV translates as faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not yet see, which seems to indicate that it is about belief. But if you look in the New King James Version, which I think is a much more helpful translation and much more in keeping with the rest of the chapter, it says this. It says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is an action that leads us to experience the reality of the thing that we have hope in. I think that's what verse 1 is saying here, because it's an experience that we have because of the choices that we are making. And when you act in faith, you get an experience of the reality of the thing that you're hoping for. Now, one of the problems we have, I think, is that today people have this idea that faith is believing in something with no reason. We talk about blind faith, don't we? Or taking a blind leap of faith, a leap of faith into the dark. Well, I don't think that's biblical faith. In fact, I don't think that's faith at all. I think that's stupidity, to believe something for no reason. None of the people you read about in Hebrews 11 did what they did for no reason. They had all reasoned it out in their minds first. The woman in our story for this morning, she didn't push through the crowds to Jesus based on blind faith for no reason. She did it based on what she had heard, maybe what she'd seen. None of us, I hope, are here this morning because of blind faith. To believe and stake your life on something for no good reason, that's not faith, that's stupidity. And I think that also means it's okay to question your faith. Some of us here are mature Christians, and yet we have deep struggles. We have deep questions. What we don't need is the rest of us saying, just believe, just have faith. Because that's not faith. That's being stupid. Faith begins with reasoning. We need to ask the questions. We need to work things through. And we should celebrate people's questions because it means they're on this journey of growth. We're not gathered here today because we've left reason at the door. We have a very good reason why we're here and why we're staking our lives on following Jesus. And part of that reason is the testimony of others. From hundreds and hundreds of people about Jesus, about his life, his death, and his resurrection. Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's writing to people who were living a long way away from where Jesus lived and worked. And he's appealing to their sound reason. He says, after that, Jesus was raised from the dead. He appeared to more than 500 people, most of whom are still living. What Paul's saying is, you can believe because of the testimony of others. You can reason this through in your mind. So faith begins with sound reasoning and a belief in the mind, but it doesn't stop there. It can't stop there. It's actually not faith if it does stop there. To turn belief into faith, we have to live as if the things we believe are true. That's what that long list of heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11 did, and that's what this woman did as she pushed through to touch Jesus. Did she have absolute certainty that she was going to be healed? No, of course she didn't. But she had heard enough about Jesus to believe it was worth living as if it was true. And so she did something incredibly courageous. She enters the crowd when, according to the religious system around her, she should not even have been there. So you can see why Jesus said it was her faith that has healed her. Because she acted on the things she believed to be true, the things she heard about Jesus. I think that's an encouragement for us in the way that we should live our faith. Living in faith means living as if the promises of Jesus are true. And that's why we can live in this broken and sinful world as if death and sin and darkness don't have the final say. Because the resurrection of Jesus says they don't. But faith isn't just a mental assent to that. It's living our lives daily in the reality of that. It begins with reason, but it turns into action. So what does that mean in practice for us? Well, I think it means that we can forgive. because we know that we have been forgiven. I think it means that we can love our enemies because we're looking forward to a coming kingdom when the lion will lie down with the lamb. It means we can give generously because we know that our treasure is in heaven. It means we can seek justice and mercy because we know that one day God will set all things right. It means we can live with humility because we know that every good gift is a gift of grace. It means we can be patient in a hurried world because we trust in God's timing rather than our own. It means we can welcome the stranger and the foreigner and the refugee because we know that we all have been included in God's family. It means we can deal honestly in our business dealings because we trust God rather than deception as the source of our provision. Faith, I don't think, is a heroic spiritual achievement. It's simply the willingness to live out and trust in the goodness of God as revealed in Jesus. It's the courage to reach out and touch the grace and to live as if it were true because it is true. Living as if we can trust him because we can trust him. Did you notice the reversal that happens here in the story? That the woman is unclean and makes anything she touches unclean until she touches Jesus. And then the direction is reversed. Instead of her uncleanliness spreading to him, his holiness spreads to her. Instead of her impurity contaminating him, his life restores her. That's a great picture of the kingdom of God. Wherever Jesus goes, sickness retreats, darkness flees, impurity dissolves, and life spreads. And I think this is important to hear. The holiness of God is not fragile. It does not need protecting. We don't need to defend it. It's contagious in the best way. For 12 years, this woman has been defined by her illness, defined by impurity, defined by exclusion. But Jesus gives her a new identity, daughter. Now, I think this story resonates with us because we all know that feeling of what it means to carry something for a long time. I'm sure we've all had that experience, and for many of us, maybe we're still carrying it. And as I was preparing for this morning, I felt strongly that I had to address one thing specifically. And that is that if there's anyone here who feels like that woman did, that for whatever reason you cannot fully participate in our worshipping community, then this morning it's time to step out in faith and let God deal with that. I don't know the reason why you feel like that, and I don't need to know the reason. What I will say is if the reason, or part of the reason, is because of anything you've heard or experienced from the church, then as a representative of part of the leadership of the church, can I apologise for that this morning and ask for your forgiveness? But I can guarantee you that whatever the reason is you feel you cannot fully participate, it's not true. Whatever the reason is that you feel you don't belong, it's not true. So if that's you, I'm going to ask you to respond this morning. We don't often ask for responses, do we? But I'm going to ask you to respond this morning. But I'm also going to ask for a response for a couple of other things. There may be people here this morning who are sick, physically sick, and in need of healing. Maybe even something that the doctors can't help with. I believe God still heals today, and there's no reason why he wouldn't this morning. So if that's you, I'd like to ask you to respond as well. And then finally, if anything I said about living in faith, about changing your belief into action, has resonated with you, if there's an area of your life in which you feel you're not living out your beliefs and you want to, you want to move your faith from reasoned belief to practical outworking in any aspect of your life, then I'd invite you to respond as well. And given what we've just heard, given that the woman had to push her way through the crowds and she had to reach out and physically touch Jesus, I felt that the response should be something physical this morning. So I'm not... it's very simple, but I'm just going to suggest that if you want to respond to any of those three things I've suggested, then during the final song, which we'll have now, just come up and touch the cross. Okay, there's nothing magical about our wooden cross on the table here, just like there's nothing magical about Jesus' cloak. But it's just a physical action that cements your response, your decision. So is that okay if we do that? And I'll hand over back to Margaret.